Good morning, everyone. I realize it's about 11:30 right now, but we will be starting shortly, probably in just maybe 2 or 3 more minutes. We're just allowing folks to get connected with the system and to log in. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative's webinar, Fatality Review, the State of the Art. I'm Stephanie Mayer, coordinator at the Family Violence Institute at Northern Arizona University. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. Due to the large number of participants, we've disabled the chat feature. If you do have a question, you can type it into the box on the tab marked Room. This will open a new tab connecting you with the moderators. The moderators may not reply directly to you, but your questions will be collected. If your question does not receive a response during the session, please feel free to email us using the contact information at the end of the presentation. I will be turning it over to Dr. Websdale. Dr. Websdale is the director of the Family Violence Institute at Northern Arizona University, as well as the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative.
Thanks, Stephanie, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen to a little information about Fatality Review and what's going on nationally, and what we've been really trying to do through the Office on Violence Against Women really for the last almost 20 years. And before I commence with the details of this, I'd like to start with a story which is really illustrative of the kind of work that we're doing in the field and what Fatality Review is really all about. It's quite a simple phenomenon in a way. Many years ago, I was at my eye doctor's office, and I came in and I was having surgery on one of my eyes, and I walked into the office, and this rather aggressive nurse in a uniform came up to me and said, you know, good morning, sir, and this and that, and then she took a marker pen out of her pocket, a heavy black marker pen, and put a cross above my left eye. I was rather perturbed by this. You know, I didn't quite know what was going on, and I said to her, excuse me, but what are you doing? And she said, well, you want the surgeon to operate on the correct eye, don't you, sir? And I said, well, yes, that would be helpful, ma'am, thank you. And she said, well, I put a cross above the eye so that the surgeon knows which eye to operate on. And I was somewhat reassured by this, but a little nervous as well. And then she said to me, you know, your left eye is my right eye looking on it, and it's very easy to make mistakes, and there are in fact lots of wrong site surgeries every year in the medical profession. And at this point I became a little more nervous, but anyway, I went to sit down in the waiting room. I waited for maybe 45 minutes and had my medication and calmed me down. And then when I walked into the operating room, there were about 30 people laid out on various gurneys with crosses on one eye or the other, and I realized quite simply why she'd put the cross on my eye. It was a preventive mechanism because she knew, as the research into the fields of medicine and aviation and nuclear fuels realizes, that we make mistakes occasionally, and sometimes systems don't work well together. So the surgeon operated on the correct eye, and things went well. And Domestic Violence Fatality Review really is about finding out sometimes what goes wrong in cases and addressing those concerns with fairly simple, straightforward interventions and changes in communication, collaboration, coordination between the various entities and stakeholders involved in these cases. So what I'd like to do is to start with a formal definition of domestic violence fatality review. And I should say too that I'm going to survey the field somewhat, but obviously in an hour and a half or even an hour and 10 minutes, and then we have 20 minutes maybe for questions, I can't survey the whole of what's going on in 40-odd states. But so I'll identify themes and do the best that I can. But first of all, let's start with a common definition, and this is a really important one for those of you who are contemplating fatality review work. Fatality review really is a way of identifying homicides, suicides, and other deaths that are caused by, related to, or somehow traceable to domestic violence. And teams review those cases in an attempt to prevent similar deaths in the future and, of course, to reduce domestic violence in general. And the working definition is important. Caused by, related to, or somehow traceable to gives us a sense of the range of cases that we're looking at and really affects the scope of the work that various teams across the country are doing. So from that simple definition, I'd just like to say a few words about the growth of domestic violence fatality review in this country. When I first came to this work in the mid-90s, just after the establishment of OVW in 1994-95, there were probably 3 or 4 review teams scattered around the country. Judge Michael Town had a review team in Hawaii. There was really an in-house judicial review of the court workings in cases where people died in domestic violence cases. Judge Jaron Berry had a similar operation over in Reno, Nevada. The Santa Clara group in California had another team involving Judge Lane Edwards at the time and others. But these were scattered, sporadic, not systematically connected with each other, and they were mostly in-house and limited. And one thing we learned was that if we could bring stakeholders to the table, as people had done in other professions such as medicine, but much more significantly perhaps even aviation and nuclear fuels, we could uncover what happened with tragic outcomes and perhaps prevent them more systematically. So the origins of fatality review, domestic violence fatality review in this country, really go back 20 years. And if you look at the slide in front of you, as of 1995, there were probably 18 domestic violence review teams present in around 13 states. As I say, these were sporadically arranged, nothing systematic. But if we move forward, we see very quickly today that there are in fact at least 175 review teams in at least 42 states. And the rise or the spread of these teams has been, quite frankly, meteoric, and we can't explain quite what it is about the spread of these teams, because especially in the earlier days, these teams were unfunded, often unfunded. There was some OVW support for some teams, but really not very much. And there's more substantial funding now, but nevertheless, this seemed to be an impulse to review cases and to prevent domestic violence killings and domestic violence in general that arose out of communities. And there were clearly a number of influences, including law enforcement, advocacy, the courts that were involved in promoting this, along with the Office on Violence Against Women and other various entities, national stakeholders in the field of domestic violence. So, that being said, let's look just very briefly at the forms and organization of fatality review teams. And again, I want to stress that there is tremendous variation across this country. I was raised in Great Britain, where centralized government is the way things are done. Often things are done by central government, and in the localities, local government take their lead in many ways from central government. In the United States, one of the beauties of this country is clearly its relationship between federal, state, and local government, and the power of local government, local initiatives. So there's tremendous variation, an eclectic array of teams. So what I'm going to do here is just highlight a few themes. Usually teams are made up of obviously review workers, people who review cases, but they're also made up of sometimes advisory boards, groups of people in communities or maybe even at state level who may or may not be involved in the nitty-gritty, the daily grind of reviewing cases, but nevertheless may inform the review process in some way and also receive information from review teams. So again, we see enormous variation across the country, but basically those 175 teams that I mentioned consist of a core of people in the community, numbering usually anywhere from 10 to 30, 35 people who will come together on a regular basis to review cases in their communities. Some states have organized this through just statewide teams. So this will often, the statewide organization will often reflect the number of homicides in a state. So states tending to have lower levels or lower numbers of intimate partner homicides or domestic violence related deaths, and lower populations in general. In Montana, for example, is one such state. Kansas might be another. They will tend to have a statewide organization whereby the team reviews selected cases and may liaise with communities. In Montana, for example, the team travels to the community to review the case and to work with the local community. The first day of their review, they will spend time as a statewide team working on the case. They will have reviewed the material beforehand and they'll talk about the case. And they'll invite their local partners in on day two. And we see similar models in other states with more Spartan populations. Other states, states like Florida, for example, California, with much higher populations, tend to have county-based teams or regional-based teams, and those teams will be semi-autonomous. And in Florida, for example, they also have a statewide team that liaises with, that draws data from each of those, I think now probably 25 county-based fatality review teams in the state. So there's kind of a relationship, negotiated relationship between some statewide entities, review teams, and local teams in states with higher populations. So we see, as I say, a lot of variation, and even within county-wide organizations, we see county-wide-based review teams or regional teams. We still see a great range of cases reviewed. Teams review different cases. They have different memberships, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I'd like to say a few words too about the linkages between these teams and child death review. As we know, in the field of domestic violence, there is often a disconnect between this idea of protecting children, in cases, for example, of child abuse and neglect, and protecting adult victims of domestic violence. And child death review teams have really developed their own trajectory under the leadership of folks like Dr. Michael Durfee and others. And they've been around a lot longer than adult domestic violence fatality review teams. But it's important to remember that those child death review teams have different foci. They come out of a tradition that is informed by a concern for children. And again, we need to remember that battered child syndrome arose in the early 1960s, whereas even battered woman syndrome, which today we view very dubiously as a concept, even that syndrome really didn't emerge until the late 70s, mid 80s. So the adult movement has lagged behind the child death review movement. But the child death review movement tends to be very scientific, informed greatly by medicine, particularly pediatrics and radiology historically. Obviously has representatives from Child Protective Services heavily involved, child investigation, death investigation teams. So their ethos is to usually, but not always, review large numbers of cases and develop aggregate data to make some pretty phenomenal determinations, for example, about fencing swimming pool areas to protect kids from drowning. I mean, these are the kinds of discoveries that came out of systematic aggregate data child death review, and they're phenomenal interventions in terms of child safety. The domestic violence fatality review teams have really blazed a different path. While teams clearly gather aggregate data, their organization is often more devoted to getting the in-depth nuances of cases, and they often spend longer on individual cases than do child death review teams. And I'll return to the process of adult death review in a moment, but in terms of the cross-fertilization of ideas between child death review teams and adult death review teams, domestic violence death review teams, we need to note that there is cross-representation. Members from child death review teams do sit on adult death review teams and vice versa, although this has been slow to occur. This at times disconnect between the way these different groups of workers see the world and indeed review cases is challenging. But this is something that we strongly recommend in terms of the organization, that you have this cross-fertilization of ideas and this communication, and that at times people actually review cases where there is adult domestic violence and child abuse and neglect co-occurring, in order to explore the way systems interact and coordinate, or don't, as the case may be. And then just a final word on that. We are beginning to make connections between the review in elder abuse cases, between suicide death reviews, and adult domestic violence death reviews and child death reviews. And there is a national movement to bring these folks together. Obviously, suicide is a major issue in the field of domestic violence, as indeed it is in the field of elder death review and indeed child death review. So there are a lot of opportunities here for groups to explore meaningful exchange. And I think this meaningful exchange can occur at least at two levels. One, we have to explore ways of analyzing aggregate data, because that aggregate data, that quantitative data analysis, can tell us so much about trends and systems and the way in which we can change systems to improve things. But I think, too, at a more micro level, these review processes can learn an enormous amount from each other about what happens and what the links are between things like elder deaths, suicide, domestic violence deaths, and child deaths, which of course are not mutually exclusive, but are all intimately interconnected. So these observations really segue into my next slide, which talks about the scope of review activity. And as I say, the teams across the country do a great variety of work. So I'm speaking in generalities here, but I think it's fair to say that when teams first started reviewing cases, they began with multiple homicides, particularly homicide-suicides. And prior to the passage of domestic violence statutes, domestic violence fatality review statutes, which enable teams to review cases with confidentiality guarantees, the multiple homicides were safer because there were no pending civil or criminal issues. The parties were dead. Usually he had killed her, and then he'd killed himself. So there was no one left around to sue or to prosecute. So those tended to be very influential cases in the early days, and remain influential cases for communities that are gearing up to implement domestic violence fatality review. And just as a buy on this, the multiple homicides account for probably about a third to 35–38% of the killings of women in innocent partner homicides a year. So these are substantial cases, and 95% of these are perpetrated by male perpetrators. Now, these single killings take the form of usually him killing her, but not always. And teams have found these invaluable cases to review as well. And what we found over the last 20 years of review is really what others have found. The fabulous risk research being done by people like Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, but also the BJS work that we've had on single killings. These things really complement each other and dovetail with each other conceptually. So the single killings, we know that men kill more, they kill for different reasons. And teams review these cases with a view to understanding them and preventing them. And what we found is that when we review cases where women kill, and we always recommend that teams review cases where women kill, because they turn up different phenomena. In nearly all cases where women kill, but not all of them, we find a prior history of woman battering. And the woman battering takes the form of what Michael Johnson calls intimate terrorism, what Evan Stark calls coercive control, but clearly a longitudinal campaign of tyranny matched with some fairly predictable risk markers in those cases that teams unravel and highlight in their review activity. So the single killings are extremely useful for us to look at. And teams have been doing this work long enough now to also begin to track trends in single and multiple killing. And I know probably everyone on this call knows this nationally, but we've seen really over the last 30 years or so a marked decline in the United States in intimate partner homicides. Probably over the last 30–35 years, we've seen a percentage point drop per year. In other words, over that period, we have probably a 30–35% decline in intimate partner homicides. Now, the reasons for this are complex. I'm not sure we know, but the teams clearly are able to speak to some of these issues in their review activities. So these findings raise questions about, well, have we tightened our systems interventions? Have we improved communication, coordination, collaboration? Have we done a better job with risk screening and safety planning? And it seems as though these are things that we have done, and we've done quite effectively, and we should probably pat ourselves on the back somewhat for that. However, the skeptic in me also says that, and again, this comes out of doing a lot of review activity, but we've also improved our emergency medical responses to crime scenes. And a bleed out that led to death 20 years ago, the bleed may well be stemmed now due to faster medical intervention, particularly in the inner city areas that were no-go areas often for law enforcement authorities 30–40 years ago. Not only do we see an increased rapidity of response, but we also see better medical technology, blood clotting technology, etc. So those single and multiple homicides form really one of the core staples of the work that teams do, and they reveal an enormous amount about the way systems work together or don't, about how bad women and perpetrators strategize in cases. And again, I'll return to that a little later. Some teams have taken to reviewing family killings, where brothers kill brothers or sisters kill sisters, much more rarely, or where children kill parents, or in the case of child death review, obviously where parents kill children. And again, I think it's worth saying that many of these family killings, particularly the child death killings, occur within a context of adult domestic violence. And this realization has come slowly to the research literature, but certainly in our early research in Florida and elsewhere, we found that at least 50%, perhaps a little more, of child abuse and neglect deaths that took place within a setting where there were two parents or caretakers present in the home, in over 50% of those cases, there was a context of adult domestic violence occurring. And that context of adult domestic violence compromised service delivery, it compromised child custody decision-making, it compromised supervised visitation, and it compromised a number of things about the delivery of services and people strategizing about how to keep children safe. So again, the family killings have been fertile ground for some teams. Other teams have looked at what we call in the research literature sexual competitor killings. And I often make light of these, not through any sense of impertinence or political incorrectness, but men tend to kill men over women. We don't see many women killing other women over men. And when I talk on the circuit about this, people often say to me, well, it's because men aren't worth it, which of course I take as an affront to my gender. But you know, anyway, the sexual competitor killings are interesting because they often involve a former batterer becoming enraged with the fact that the woman he victimized has moved on to someone else. And we've seen a number of killings in these circumstances, and we've also seen a number of killings of children in these sexual competitor circumstances. And these reviews of such cases raise very interesting and compelling safety questions for us, safety planning questions, strategies that deal with not just making safety plans, but deal with child custody, orders of protection, additional protections, stakeholder responses, etc., etc. So teams have found sexual competitor killings extraordinarily useful. In our national work, and just for those of you that are on the call, we do have our next national conference that OVW have just approved, taking place in Florida in mid-May of next year, and those details will be up on our website fairly soon. But that conference will be about reflecting the work that communities are doing with their review work, and will, as always, be focused heavily upon the practicalities of reviewing cases. And one of the cases that we've recommended that groups review over the years, even from the earliest points of inception of teams, are cases of suicides. And I'd just like to spend a few moments speaking about the enormous importance of reviewing suicides. And a number of teams, the Georgia folks have pioneered in this area, but there are a number of teams in Florida have looked at this. There's a group in California, I believe, out of Sacramento, that's gone in this direction. There are a number of groups that have done this, but if we look nationally at the suicide data, we have roughly, according to the CDC, 40,000 suicides a year. Of those suicides, roughly 8,000 involve women. We really have no way of knowing systematically how many of those women are in domestic violence relationships. In other words, it is possible that a significant number of those women who commit suicide are exiting violent, controlling, or deeply intimidating relationships. And the evidence that we have on this is merely suggestive. Some teams find a high co-occurrence of suicide and previous domestic violence. Other teams, and by high I'm talking here about maybe 25% of women's suicides in a particular locale will involve a prior history of domestic violence, or at least injury patterns over the life course that comport with domestic violence wounding. But other teams report less, and the only way we're going to move forward with this is for teams to start looking at these suicides. But the possibility of significant numbers of women, and if it were to be as high as 20–25%, then we can safely say that nationally there are more women exiting violent relationships through suicide than there are through homicide. Because 25% of 8,000 is going to give us 2,000. Even if it's 20% or 15%, it's still higher than the number of women who will lose in single partner killings and homicide suicides combined. nationally. So that whole area of suicide review is important. And what we've found from teams that have reviewed suicides is that they've turned up really different sets of findings. What they found is that while formal domestic violence stakeholders, for example, advocacy, law enforcement, the courts, may not be involved as much in suicide cases involving battered women, they do find that public health services, mental health services, play a key role in those cases. So that it really opens up different avenues of exploration for us that speaks to the importance of having what I call wide-angle lens or comprehensive fatality review that looks at all nuances of cases and also brings large numbers of people to the table. I'd like to just say a few words now about men's suicide. Of those 40,000 suicides, we probably lose 32,000 suicides a year. 32,000 suicides a year involve men. And again, we have no way of knowing how many of those men in those relationships, in those suicides, were either the perpetrators or potentially the victims of domestic violence. But that number is astronomical. It is much higher than the homicide levels for men. And these reviews, I think, are one of the great ways of the future in terms of doing adult domestic violence fatality review. Because we need to know how we can intervene in these cases, how we can bring our public health acumen to bear, how we can bring support services. And given the data that we have on the fairly limited time frame involved in making the decision to commit suicide, this raises all kinds of questions about not only safety planning, but the availability of weapons in homes, the removal of weapons, access to weapons, and access to things like alcohol, UAs, screens, particularly in cases where we see adoption of children, foster care decisions with CPS. I mean, these are very complicated issues. But the men's suicide stuff is huge, and we need to do more of that work. Moving right along, the indirect deaths are really deaths that we've learned over the years it's important to highlight. And this goes back to the original definition of domestic violence fatality review. And these are the deaths really that are related to domestic violence or somehow traceable to domestic violence. And what they do is, these kinds of deaths, and here I would include, for example, the deaths of homeless women, or indeed men sometimes. The data on this is mixed. If you look at the urban data, the deaths of homeless women from the urban studies, roughly 20% of the deaths of urban women who are homeless are linked in some way to a history of domestic violence, biography of domestic violence. In other words, their domestic violence was the thing that was the principal reason for them to be on the street in the first place. Now, the earlier research on this, the research published in Clearinghouse Review by Joan Zorza in 1991, actually, and this was the original federal research, this came up with 59%. So somewhere in between the 59% and the 20% gives us a sense of the magnitude, the importance of domestic violence in terms of putting people on the street. And as our homeless populations have changed in the last generation, it's very clear that women and children on the street have come to be the single biggest demographic change in the homeless population that we've had, along with obviously changes in the presence of the mentally ill on the street, whether they be men or women. So reviewing deaths of homeless women, some teams have found that to be very beneficial. And the Philadelphia Death Review Initiative from the earliest days pioneered in that area and did some fabulous work. Also, we might number the indirect deaths, we might include in those indirect deaths HIV/AIDS-related deaths. And we know that particularly battered women are peculiarly at risk of contracting HIV infections. If we look at CDC data in Atlanta, for example, We look at the case histories of, say, for example, African American women in the inner city who died from AIDS. You know, we're looking at a significant number of women who have biographies of abuse. And of course, given the fact that they're abusers, may refuse to use condoms as a control issue, may have multiple partners, may have used IV drugs, may have forced anal sex, may have spent more time in jail and prison where the infection rates are much higher for HIV, etc., etc. I mean, if you put all those public health markers together, what you've got there is a much higher level of vulnerability on the part of battered women to contracting HIV infections. So again, we've encouraged teams to do this work. We've encouraged them to look at HIV data. I understand this is very difficult. I understand there are HIPAA requirements around this that make this sometimes very difficult, but nevertheless, these are challenging issues in terms of indirect deaths. I also would want to note the deaths of sex workers or street prostitutes, or even not street prostitutes for that matter. Often they have biographies of abuse, and again, folks like the Philadelphia team have pioneered historically in reviewing those deaths and linking them up to domestic violence. And then finally, again, as we all know, battered women are much more likely to medicate their pain, to become involved in you know, addictive drug use, etc., etc. So drug overdoses, we just shouldn't assume they're just drug overdoses. There may be histories of abuse in there. And these are ways of highlighting the political relevance and the economic impact of domestic violence in terms of mortality and morbidity. A couple of other exciting areas. Some teams have passed amendments to their domestic violence statutes, the fatality review statutes, that have enabled them to review near fatalities. And near fatalities is essentially defined in those statutes as deaths that would have occurred essentially but for immediate medical intervention, life-saving medical intervention. So these are pretty serious injuries, for example, that would have led out to death but for the presence of medical personnel, EMTs, etc. So, but the near fatalities are valuable, and certainly from my own experience of doing near-death review, they tell us things that we cannot learn from the other cases, often because victims will speak. And when victims speak to us, because they've survived and they want to speak to us, they tell us things about the way they see systems that we cannot learn just from document analysis, archival analysis, or even from interviewing surviving family members, community members, co-workers, etc. So the near fatalities are particularly rich cases. And again, we've encouraged teams to go down this path. Arizona, Georgia, a number of states have moved in this direction. And if you look at our website, you can see all the statutes. Our website, by the way, is NDVFRI, National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative.org. And you'll see the statutes up there and the amendments or addendums to them, and you'll be able to get a glimpse for yourself as to which teams are doing this. But the near fatalities are valuable. They do raise difficult human subject issues sometimes. They raise issues about the protection and the ethical treatment of formerly battered women who've survived. They do raise questions about who we interview and how we do it. Do we interview perpetrators? And I'll return to this, these issues in a moment. But again, Jacqueline Campbell's excellent work nationally has shown, she published a piece in 2007 that speaks to these issues, but the near fatalities probably outnumber the fatalities by 9 to 1. So there's no shortage of cases here, and these are important cases to review. And finally, on this slide, I want to say a few words about bystander deaths, because and the Vermont folks I know have done some great work in this area. In fact, they had a conference a number of years ago on bystander deaths. And these are important. These are important for alerting the general public to the dangers posed by perpetrators in these cases, but we have a significant number of deaths of co-workers and of people, for example, in shopping malls who get shot, who get in the crossfire in these cases. And the bystander deaths again tell us important things about, for example, workplace safety planning, about how battered women communicate what's meaningful to them in the workplace and what is done or not done about those things. So these are important issues, and in general, we really encourage teams to ask questions about the scope of the work that they do. Obviously, with shrinking resources, review teams do not have time to review every case that comes across their desk. There are some jurisdictions that try to do this, there are some jurisdictions that gather aggregate data, and that's laudable, but the technical assistance we provide to teams is really to say to them, review what's comfortable and what's workable for you, and review in depth if you can, and pick cases that you learn from. Select cases strategically to present new learning opportunities and new opportunities for strategic, systematic interventions. I think coming to the end of the slide here, I have a question that's come up that I'd like to mention. The question is this: how are the teams who are doing suicide reviews getting the mental health community to participate in the review process? And that's a great question. The mental health folks, the second part of the question is, how are they getting the mental health community to be willing to go past HIPAA? The HIPAA constrictions are tricky and difficult, and HIPAA, as you know, protects decedents and their medical records, sensitive medical records, for 50 years post being deceased. However, there are ways around this, and I recommend that for a full exploration of this, that you go to the health information of deceased individuals on the HHS website to look very closely at the HIPAA privacy rule. But there are ways around this, and clearly family members who are personal representatives of estates have the ability to provide mental health data. It is also possible to, in suicide cases, to have mental health professionals report in generic form what they do in cases, as opposed to reporting specific details of cases. And we are basically negotiating this with various jurisdictions as we proceed. In Arizona, for example, where I live and work often, there are some licensed clinical social workers and psychologists who've been reluctant to participate in death review because even although the statutory protections allow them to do that to some degree, they have feared the licensing bodies somehow adopting a less than positive view of them going down that path. And these developments are things that are unfolding as we speak. But I do want to say a few words about the presence of mental health professionals on fatality review teams. When we first started this work back in the 90s, there was a great tension between advocates of domestic violence, criminal justice practitioners, law enforcement in particular. There were many tensions between those groups, but also there was a reluctance to see mental health professionals come to the table. Mainly because there was a concern, particularly on the part of advocates, to explain killings in terms of the power and control that batterers had over victims, and that the killing itself was really a manifestation of the power and control, or the ebbing power and control of batterers over victims. And this was in some ways an unfortunate phenomenon, because really it involved putting the cart before the horse. The whole purpose of the review was to try to find out what happened, to try to understand the death, rather than framing it automatically as an expression or a manifestation of his power and control. So those advocacy community members were reluctant to see mental health members come to the table because mental health professionals provided a different perspective. Our position on this at the initiative is clear, that we need a wide array of people at the table to offer differing perspectives and to be uncomfortable with each other at the table. And the mental health professionals add that. And I'll return to that in just a moment when we start to speak about membership. So moving on to the next slide. And really what I just said sort of segues into this rather neatly. But the philosophy of fatality review work is absolutely crucial to its success. And I want to spend just a little bit of time on this. If we go back to the example that I used to sort of foreground the discussion today, the medical professionals who asked the nurse or had the nurse put a cross above my eye came to the conclusion that they were wrong site surgeries by candidly analyzing the mistakes that were made. People who reviewed aircraft crashes reviewed those aircraft crashes candidly, and they created a culture of safety within cockpits where junior pilots felt comfortable challenging or questioning the decisions of senior pilots and captains. We don't see the same level of comfort with challenge in the medical profession. We don't see the same level of comfort of surgeons being challenged by, for example, nurse anesthetists or attending nurses. We don't see them being as accepting of feedback. However, in nuclear fuels and aviation, we've rendered those industries much safer because we've learned from mistakes and because we've learned not to blame and shame specific individuals. If you go back, and one of the early areas of research on this phenomenon came from the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, and the Soviets had spent many years basically hushing up small nuclear accidents in their nuclear installations because they didn't want to engender a sense of fear. And they wanted the general public to be supportive of nuclear energy. And they didn't want to create a sense of fear that might have been stimulated by revealing small accidents. The problem with that is that nobody learned. And what we have there is a culture of sort of malfeasance and neglect and failure to discuss things, a failure of openness. And it resulted in many ways in Chernobyl, which was in many ways a preventable outcome, potentially. So, but we've learned from medicine, and we've learned from aviation, and we've learned from nuclear fuels that you cannot attribute a particular accident or tragic outcome to just one simple cause. These events are multi-determined. They're very, very complex. And in that sense, they're very similar to domestic violence cases and killings, which are enormously complicated at a number of levels. Obviously the levels of systems, interactions, but also at the level of the relationship, the complex, confusing relationship between victims and perpetrators, and also at the level of just the emotional pushes and pulls that the different actors experience as they move towards these lethal outcomes. So in a sense, the domestic violence fatality review philosophy has benefited enormously from the philosophy in these other sectors. But the no blame and shame is crucial. You cannot point fingers at individuals and expect individuals to come to the table and share information. So this was pivotal for us in the early days. And many people said to us, well, we don't like the fact we should blame and shame because, you know, people have committed these homicides. And we say, well, you know, if you really want to blame and shame individuals, if you want to talk about the guy that pulled the trigger, that's cool. Or if you're a radical feminist and you want to talk about the structure of patriarchy, okay, that's cool. But the bottom line is we want players in communities sharing information. We're not suggesting for a second that people not be accountable. We want accountability. In fact, we demand it. And what we found from teams is that teams are not in the business of hushing up things. Communities know what goes on for the most part. The key here is to balance this need to have confidential exchange in a non-blaming and shaming environment with an accountability that creates a milieu for change. And that's what we've tried to set up in the States and in the locales and in, for example, county-based review teams. So these lessons from other fields, this creation of the culture of safety, has been absolutely axiomatic, basic to the success of fatality review teams. So, notwithstanding those comments, let me now move on, really the corollary here in terms of team membership. Teams have grown enormously. In the earlier days, almost 20 years ago now, we found a small group of very highly invested individuals coming to the table. And they often consisted of advocates, concerned police officers, judges, court clerks, public health individuals or whatever. But what we've seen is an enormous proliferation, not just in the number of teams, but in the level of sophistication of the analysis. And our guiding principle here at the initiative has always been to recommend inclusivity and creativity. And I don't use the word inclusivity in some kind of politically correct way. I mean it in a sense of we have to involve those individuals who are touched by the lives of battered women and who are involved in the lives of perpetrators. We need those people involved in agencies, community stakeholders, other entities, workplaces, who can speak to the issues involved in these cases, and much more broadly to the issues involved in those communities. So we need inclusivity, and just to give you one example, it took us a long time to realize nationally that battered women are more likely to share their stories with pastors and members of faith communities than they are with advocates or law enforcement even. So it took us a long time, and we've often learned through our mistakes, to recommend teams bringing members from, for example, interministerial alliances, members from, say, women's groups in churches, clergy, synagogues, mosques. I mean, bringing folks to the table from multiple backgrounds to be inclusive, in a way that really fleshes out the details and the compromises. Because the ideal kind of death review is a review that recreates the case through the lens of the victim and the perpetrator that lived the case. It matters not at some level how many services we have or what array of services we offer or how logical we think that array is. What matters is how victims see that and how perpetrators see that and act upon that perception. And the inclusivity helps us get at that sense of perception on the part of those key players. So the second piece of this is the creativity. This requires us to think outside the box. And again, I tell fatality review teams, we want fresh ideas. We want new people to come to the table. We want to discover new links rather than just having the same old players at the table. We need new blood. And we're not going to solve these problems until we render this a community problem. This is not, as we well know, a criminal justice problem. It's a problem about community life, it's about economic life, it's about safe housing, it's about jobs, it's about affordable housing, it's about advocacy, it's about seeing the world through the lens of victims and perpetrators themselves. It's very complicated stuff. So team membership needs to be inclusive, creative. If you go to our website and look at the team membership section, you will see there a large list of what I call the usual suspects. And you know this in your own communities, and this will differ somewhat by community, but clearly we want you to be inclusive of a wide array of people. And I would include in that, and I really like this aspect of the work, but I always recommend, prosecutors' offices are hot to jump on this and have their representatives at the table. But they're less apt or less inclined to welcome with open arms defense bar to the table. And I find having defense bar at the table incredibly helpful, incredibly useful because of the different array of perspectives. And if the pursuit here is the pursuit of justice, then having these different factions present in the review process becomes very important. We need domestic violence survivors of domestic violence at the table. They may wear a different hat. They may not be there as a survivor. They may be, depending on how the team does that. That's an onerous burden to have someone at the table who's a representative of survivors groups. But however we do this, we want that voice, because that voice is going to tell us how systems are working in our communities. So their presence is vital. We absolutely need to have the perspectives of families, surviving family members, friends, neighbors, and co-workers present. And this is difficult work. This is not for the faint-hearted. Engaging family members is, I think, personally, the richest part of the work that we do. It provides us with the best data, the most important data in many ways. These folks know of the compromises in ways that systems players often do not. We've always had resistance, certainly in our early days, to having family members present. Law enforcement entities found this threatening. The courts sometimes found this threatening. Even advocacy sometimes found this threatening. But again, in the spirit of open inquiry and wide-angle lens review, we need family members there. To suggest that their data is anything less than extremely important is crucial. We treat the data from families and friends and neighbors as we treat all data. And that is, it goes into the mix, it's scrutinized, it's related to other data, and it's put together. And we want that multiplicity of perspectives. We want that interdisciplinary melange to help us do more thorough reviews, more searching systems reviews to honor victims and their families, their friends, their neighbors, their co-workers in the work that we do. So team membership is important. Eclectic is the key here. If you go to our website, NDVFRI.org, if you scroll down to the bottom of the home page, you'll see a 20-minute film put together and paid for by the U.S. Department of Justice on the Montana Fatality Review Commission. It's one of our sterling examples of great review work, and the team reviews a case. They take 2 days to do it, and they've done some great work. And for those of you that are contemplating maybe forming teams, this is a great 20-minute video to get you interested. And obviously, this is something that we are interested in too, working with you as you move forward. And we actually have technical assistance to support communities who have OVW grants, and even a small number that do not. And then finally, the last point on this slide, our community focus groups are things that we've always recommended. The West Palm Beach group in Florida pioneered in this area many years ago, and they had a group of survivors that actually didn't like the word survivors. They called themselves thrivers. And the review team in those days would deliberate, would come up with their recommendations, and they would run those recommendations by community focus groups of previously battered women to ask them for their insights into, does this make sense? Does that make sense? Does this gel with your experience? How might we do this differently? And again, this is local democracy in action. It's civic engagement in action. And it's difficult. And the more uncomfortable we feel, particularly as systems players, the more beneficial the review process is. The great irony of the work. The work is paradoxical at a number of levels. It's problematic at some levels. But the more threatening potentially it is, the more valuable it is and the greater strides that we can make. So I want to say a few words now about the fatality review process. And this is really about reviewing cases. And I don't want to spend too long on this, only because in our conferences, and again I've mentioned the conference in May next year, but throughout our work, whether we come to your community and work with you, and again, this is something that we have technical assistance funds to do, or whether you come to us and we anonymize a review. We've got a library of reviews, and communities select case types they want to review with us, or they come to our conferences and do this. But just a few words about the process. We value, obviously, subjective, in-depth review that really valorizes human experience and the complexity of human experience and the oftentimes disconnect between that human experience, whether it's batterers or whether it's victims, doesn't matter. The disconnect between those experiences and the offerings that systems and stakeholders make available to victims. We want to know about that disconnect. We want to know about those human experiences with bureaucracies, with the way the system works or doesn't work for victims, in order to fine-tune and respond better to those folks. But we also obviously value hard data in the sense of crime statistics. We value statewide data. If teams want to make changes or suggest new developments, either at a legislative level or in terms of new funding lines, new funding opportunities, we obviously want to gather aggregate data as well. So these become important complementary aspects of reviews, the subjective and the objective or aggregate components. One thing we always recommend is that teams not shackle themselves to reviewing instruments. And I speak as a researcher and a writer here. I really mean this sort of tongue-in-cheek, but if you have researchers telling you, well, we have to adhere to the instrument, we have to check the box on the instrument, we need to be telling them no. The box is not there to run the review. The review is about recreating the lives of the players in this case, and it's about putting a review together that is responsive to community need, to the needs of battered women, and to the needs of perpetrators for that matter. So this needs to be something that, you know, maybe an instrument, a tool, an assessment tool is filled in at some point later, but you know, the review process is about deliberative democracy between team members. It's about sharing experiences, about everybody talking. It's about realizing everyone's potential at the table. And the more permeable this is with the community, the more community stakeholders are involved, the more we learn about this, the more able we are to improve community responses, coordinated community responses to domestic violence, and to turn it into more of a community issue as opposed to a law enforcement issue or a courts issue. So we commence our work by building a timeline. It's basically a linear chronology of essential events on the case that may go back to the earliest days in the lives of victims and perpetrators, or even their family members, who knows. But the idea of the chronology is to recreate a sense of the case over time. And as we know, domestic violence cases, especially the intimate terrorism cases, are cases of what I call accumulation. These deaths build over a long period of time. They're not just one-off examples of sort of implosive violence. These are not like stranger assaults on the street. They build over time. But the criminal justice system in particular is geared to analyze events at the level of the individual incident. And fatality review is designed to transcend that logic and to access the longitudinal development of a case, the unfolding of the case. So the timeline is important, and you can do this by putting pieces of paper on a wall. If you look at the Montana Review, you'll see this. Or you can do this using Excel spreadsheets. You can project this up onto a wall, onto a screen, onto a monitor, whatever you like. There are many ways to do this. But the timeline is important, and only once we've constructed the timeline do we, quite sadly actually, see the intensification of things like risk markers and activity preceding the killing. And that intensification, that density, these are things that we want folks in communities, stakeholders, law enforcement folks, to appreciate before the killing. So we want the law enforcement officer that does, say, for example, a risk assessment, to understand the development of the case over time. In other words, we want to change the incident-based consciousness to a longitudinal consciousness or appreciation of the case and its development. So the first part of the review, and it's a four-part process, the first part of the review is to build the timeline. Everyone contributes to this ideally. Again, it's part of the democratic process. Everyone contributes. People discuss it. Is this important? Is this worth putting on? Is this not? No, I think this is more important. No, I think you've made a mistake here, or the document's faulty here, or this or that. And it's a deliberation. The second part of the review is to explore what I call the antecedents, or sometimes called red flags. What happens before the death? These are the risk markers in our communities, in our cases. And the standard risk markers, and I'm going to do a separate webinar on this. I'm going to do a webinar in the next few months on what happens before an intimate partner homicide, where I talk about these things. But how is the domestic violence changing? Are the parties separating? Is he obsessively possessive? Is he depressed? Is he using alcohol excessively? Is he chronically drunk? Does he have problems with authority? Is there a stepchild in the home? All these various things. I mean, we put those together as antecedents, and the idea is that we map these not just as one case, but as community risk markers, and we make sure that we're asking these questions in our cases, in our communities, and in our states. The third part of the review is what I call agency and community involvement. And the easy part of this is listing the agencies and communities involved. We can often do that, and again, very sadly, we find, I would say in the majority of cases nationally, there is pretty minimal agency involvement. Women often die alone, and men kill in isolation. In the sense that they have not been exposed to the system that often. I would say at least half the cases we see only minimal involvement of systems. So listing the agencies is one thing. Listing the community players. Was the pastor involved? Was the local shelter involved? Did someone go to the hospital emergency room? If so, how were they screened? Were they asked questions about domestic violence? Was there a retroactive pulling up of their health records to see how this had developed over time? I mean, there are all kinds of things that we can do here. But the question is not just about who was involved and which players were involved, but it's also about what I call the 3 C's. What was the level of coordination, communication, and collaboration between those various entities? Because it's probably in that coordination, collaboration, communication that we're going to solve at least some of these problems and prevent some of these homicides and make major inroads. So the recommendations section is the final section that I want to talk about today at least. And I want to say a few words about this. I mean, these are social action items, essentially. These are items that teams come up with that they think they have a chance of changing. They want to make a difference. And if you go to our website, you can certainly look at great length to the numbers of changes that are made. And I obviously don't have time to go through these changes. If you look at the film, you can see specific changes the Montana group made. But clearly, you want recommendations that are carefully thought through, that are limited in number, that you have a chance of some success in introducing, and that you don't leave a trail of recommendations that are unimplemented. You want to be modest and realistic, and you want some success, and you ideally want to have feedback loops in communities about those recommendations. You want to have feedback loops at the level of community focus groups, particularly groups of battered women, but then you also want to have feedback loops within the team and within perhaps more broader coordinated community responses to DV, in the sense that you want to track over time the implementation of those recommendations. So again, the idea here is long-term planning. Setting up a fatality review initiative is not just about setting up an initiative for a short period of time. It's about 5- and 10-year plans. So with that in mind, the recommendations have to be realistic, and they have to be agreed upon by the team and team members. So these are things that you know, are complicated, take time, and then at this point I think I'll say a few words about confidentiality, although I've already touched on some of this. We can move on to this slide. The statutory protections are enshrined in the Fatality Review legislation. If you go to our website, you can see that. The HIPAA stuff is complex for some cases, only because adult domestic violence fatality review teams are not exempt from HIPAA requirements, as are the child death review teams. So there are problems there with sharing information across boundaries there and who can do what. Clearly, confidentiality in fatality review cases is designed so that it doesn't interfere with prosecution. And with homicide-suicides, we can review cases quickly. Jurisdictions differ, but the confidentiality is designed to insulate the team from subpoena. For example, a police chief could not subpoena the information in many states. That might speak to the performance of a specific officer to access that officer's performance for disciplinary reasons. That may or may not be something that teams might appreciate, but nevertheless, it's mostly the way things are. So ideally, we don't want to interfere with the prosecution of the case, although there are some state statutes, and the Florida statute is one example, but there are a few others, where it is possible to review a live case. And there are cases that have run live or that have not exhausted their appellate issues where the review has taken place. Clearly there are issues here for the advocacy community. There are issues here about victims' confidential information. And there are issues about family members coming to the table. Family members cannot necessarily come to the table with the expectation that they will learn anything above the public record. It is not within the scope of most teams legally to share private or confidential information with family members about their lost loved ones. Advocates claim advocate privilege, and given that probably less than 1% of intimate partner homicide cases involve women who've been to shelters, residential shelters, this issue is somewhat moot anyway, but some shelters have taken to exploring the possibility of issuing waivers to battered women. In other words, in the unlikely event of your death from any cause, would you be willing for us to share information with review teams? And some shelters have done that, others haven't. It's a controversial issue nationally. And it's certainly not something that we can deal with in this call, but it is something that will be the subject of a much more detailed future call with one of our legal consultants further on down the road. So I'd like to wrap this up so we can take a few questions. Just a few words about the benefits. I don't think we should claim that the rise of fatality review or CCRs in general has definitively been shown to reduce intimate partner homicides, but there is a clear correlation between all these different multi-agency interdisciplinary initiatives and the decline of the homicide rate, which I mentioned earlier. I think we've seen interagency communication improve dramatically with the rise of fatality review, both at a formal and an informal level. I think we've seen the issuance of more resources based on fatality review findings, and we've seen reports speak to those issues. I think we've seen numerous systems changes, which are far too many to mention here, but again, be the subject perhaps of a separate webinar. And we've obviously seen new laws passed in many ways to address these issues. So finally, let's just say a few words about report writing. Report writing itself is something that we address at our conferences and in our technical assistance that we deliver to communities. Clearly we need to know who we're writing to. The style of writing needs to be clear, concise, written in the active voice, just short declarative sentence, balance between case storytelling and subjective objective aggregate data. We want to not have identifying information leak over into case studies and reports, so we need a very, very careful analysis of anonymized information, etc. And we need reports to have perhaps special foci, special things in communities, whether they be things like domestic violence among police officers, trafficked women, contract films, things like this. So that being said, I just want to give you my contact information and website information and my phone number. Feel free to call if you have any questions. And I just want to address a couple of questions. The navigating confidentiality. One person has asked me, how are successful review groups navigating confidentiality? It is actually entirely possible to do a very thorough, detailed review with public record information. One can make a Freedom of Information Act request to get files from police departments, but usually with police department representation, this is not a problem. Team members sign off on confidentiality guarantees. There are often penalties attached to breach of confidentiality guarantees. The activities of the teams, the deliberations, the documents are shielded. There's an absolute shield for those documents. So the deliberations are private, they're confidential, and they cannot be accessed. So for the most part, the states have those things in place. So successful teams have successful confidentiality statutes. There are examples up on our website. You don't need to recreate the wheel. The HIPAA stuff does get tricky sometimes with health information. But as I said earlier, if you go to the HHS website, there are ways around this. There are ways around this with the personal representatives of family members. Another question concerns avoiding blame. How do we avoid blame? The simple answer to that is that we discuss it at the front end, and we agree upon a certain philosophy and strategy, and we recognize that it's important not to blame and point the finger. And yes, privately, in small groups, if a group goes out to a coffee shop after discussing a case and they're talking about, oh my God, shouldn't this group have done something different? That's one thing, but often the group at the table, whether it's law enforcement, the hospital, the police, whatever, they often know this anyway. I found law enforcement agencies involved in fatality review to be enormously progressive in terms of recognizing we could have done things differently here. They don't want these deaths any more than anybody else. So I don't think the blame issue is that big of a deal. Holding people to account is in some ways more tricky in that you have to organize team activity to track the recommendations. If a group commits to make certain changes, then people need to be held accountable for that and brought to the table. And it often helps to have senior personnel in organizations like police departments, courts, court administrators on board with this work. And that's why some groups have found it helpful to have advisory boards that don't review cases, but that handle policy recommendations and information. But the accountability piece takes work. It takes tracking change, tracking what you've written, and seeing it implemented. Another question asks, you describe a balance that is surely very difficult to achieve or perhaps even to get near. That's such a great question. And I think there's tremendous variation across the country. But really we're talking here about people coming to the table from different walks of life with tremendously complex cases. And what I find is that the balance is rendered much easier as teams do their work in the way that is perhaps the most detailed and comprehensive. Detailed, comprehensive death review is incredibly interesting, fascinating, and it throws up all kinds of questions. And that process itself that I've described in somewhat rudimentary fashion actually contributes towards developing a balance. It's not just about bringing players to the table who come from disparate places, whether it be politically or otherwise. It's about engaging those players and coalescing those players around the process of the review. So what we find is that the process of the review itself, if you make it in-depth, if you make it stimulating, if you make it relevant to people's lives, if you don't make it bureaucratic, if you don't shackle it to an instrument, what you're going to find is that that balance will emerge over time. Is it uncomfortable? Of course it is. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Do people disagree? Of course they do. It's the same as any social group that you bring together. And what we found, interestingly, is if you stimulate the group by bringing different people in and building different, what might seem to be obscure or arcane bridges with the community, it enhances the balance. There's a great irony there, but the social networks research on this bears this out. It's very interesting. So I think people do get near to it. I do think they achieve some balance. It's not perfect. People continue to die, but we do see major improvements. So I think that takes care of that particular question. The team role in implementing recommendations, I think some teams clearly have taken to forming implementation subcommittees, or they've taken to bringing in people in the community, invoking the support of police chiefs, judges, or whoever to help inform change. Folks who are change makers, maybe, they deliberately looked at that. I've got a very long question here that I'm reviewing and I don't have time to read. Do you come across, this is a great question, this might be a good way to draw this to a close, do you come across collaborative denials or cover-ups in some teams? You know, I've been doing this work for 20 years and obviously I don't go to all reviews. I have never come across a cover-up in 20 years of doing review work, traveling, and actually working in almost every state in the Union. I've never come close to even something that smacks of that. And if you think of that, it's a great question, but I'm not saying they don't exist. They may have happened. But if you have a diverse group at the table, the challenges come from within the group. And for example, in my local community, there are probably 30 people on the Fatality review team. And the thought of someone standing up at that meeting from the sheriff's department or the local police department saying, hey, we screwed up here, we need to hush this up, or we need to fudge this documentation, it doesn't happen. There are too many different voices, there are too many different players, the ethical commitment is so strong that that, for the most part, isn't going to happen. But one thing we do see is that in some teams, while there may not be a collaborative denial or cover-up, there are limited ways of seeing cases. And what I do see is with teams that shackle themselves to filling out a research instrument, it's almost as if some teams have blinkers on. You know, it's almost as if some teams want to make a decision about why this occurred even before they invoke all the talents at the table. I've come across teams that have one person do the timeline, or I've come across teams where not all members of the team review the documentation thoroughly, or some review it cursorily. I mean, if you do the process well, cover-ups, denials, and even blinkered interpretations are things that are much, much less likely to go on. I've got a question here about report submission in general. And again, there's tremendous variation here. In some states, for example, Arizona, where I live, there are 13 fatality review teams now in various stages of development, and those teams report to the Attorney General's office, and the Attorney General's office at the moment is in the process of trying to decide what to do with these reports and how to best move forward with that systematic data. And this process is in its infancy. In other states like Florida, for example, with a much more long-established network of teams, that reporting mechanism, both the aggregate data and the recommendations mechanism, has a much more sophisticated, organized conduit that's developed through the statewide team that was set up by the Attorney General in Florida. There are some teams, statewide teams that meet, for example, the Montana team that I mentioned before that does really superb work. Their director of their team, Matthew Dale, reports to the legislature once every 2 years, and their written report is reported to the legislature and really aerates or renders permeable their whole process, suitably anonymized, of course, in terms of the level of individual cases. So I think the questions we've pretty much exhausted. I think we're coming to the end of our webinar. I really want to thank you for listening with us. We will be doing a series of these. We'll return to the airwaves and the webinar format. We certainly enjoy doing that, and we hope that that's a way to work with you. So thank you for your time. We appreciate it, and thank you for all the great work that you do out there.
Thank you, Dr. Websdale. You should all be receiving an email shortly containing a link to a SurveyMonkey evaluation. We would really appreciate it if you took a few minutes just to fill that out and offer us some feedback. And thank you to all of the team at the Family Violence Institute for assisting with moderation. The next webinar in the series will take place in September, and the announcement should go out shortly. Thank you.